Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. Shadows behind a mirror, the fog that enveloped the town seemed unusual, even for this corner of America. It always came with the sunset, slowly filling the narrow streets and old houses. While other cities in the world were preparing for the nightlife, this place only became more empty. The streets, once crowded with people during the day, now seemed abandoned, and their buildings began to lean under the weight of time. Yet, one house remained alive. It was an old farm at the edge of the town. Everyone knew about it, but no one dared to approach. It had a reputation, a house where people once lived who disappeared without a trace, and where strange events, according to rumors, occurred. Some said the place was cursed, others claimed that something truly sinister existed there that no one could understand. Jack, a young man who had recently moved to the town, became intrigued by this story. He was new to this small and backward place, and over time, he heard several strange tales. The elderly people sitting on benches by the shop usually discussed various events in the town, and among them, there were frequent mentions of the farm. They said that in the evenings, when the fog grew particularly thick, eerie sounds came from the house, creaking doors or rustling, as if someone were walking inside. But the most frightening story was about the Johnson house, which had disappeared decades ago. They say his soul still seeks peace in the fog. One day, on the eve of Halloween, when the town was filled with the atmosphere of dark secrets, Jack decided he would go to that house. He didn't believe in such tales, but something about this place troubled him. Perhaps it was his curiosity, perhaps his desire to prove to everyone that these were just the old people's fantasies. After passing through a small forest, Jack arrived at the dilapidated farm. The house's windows were darkened, and the door seemed to have been closed for far too long. Everything around was abandoned, overgrown with weeds, but still held a luxurious spirit of past times. The entrance was covered in dust, and though the house's appearance was frightening, Jack felt he had to go in. He opened the old door, stepped over the threshold, and was immediately embraced by darkness. He couldn't help but notice how heavy and damp the air inside was. The ceiling was low, and the walls were covered with dark stains, as if the liquid never dried. He lit a flashlight and began moving through the rooms. As soon as he entered one of them, his gaze stopped on an old mirror hanging on the wall. The mirror was dusty, but in its surface, his own eyes were not reflected. Jack froze, feeling his blood run cold. The shadows in the mirror moved as if they had a will of their own, and Jack felt something heavy and unfriendly watching him. Suddenly, the mirror shuddered, as if its surface became alive for a moment. Jack took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, he heard a quiet but clear whisper from behind him. "Go further," Jack, though terrified, could not resist. He turned back to the mirror and noticed something new on it. Not his own reflection, but that of an old man. He looked like one of those who had once lived in this house, with dark eyes that seemed to be staring at him across centuries. "Do you know what happened to us?" The voice spoke. Jack felt his hands begin to tremble, and the flashlight almost fell from his hands. He tried to back away, but at that moment, the door slammed shut with a terrible bang. He was locked inside. The fog outside grew thicker, and strange sounds began to emerge from the darkness. Footsteps approaching. Jack started searching for an exit, but the house was filled with more and more strange noises. Doors opening and closing, chains clanging in the empty rooms. His heart was beating faster, and eventually, he couldn't take it anymore. He ran down the hallway, not knowing where he was going. Then, before him appeared a dark figure, a man who looked exactly like the one he had seen in the mirror. The same eyes, the same facial features, but with a smile that left no doubt. "You think we left this place?" The man whispered, and his voice was as cold as the winter wind. Jack tried to scream, but his voice didn't come out. With every step, the fog grew deeper around him. He could no longer understand anything. Everything was twisted, mixed in a terrifying nightmare. Since then, Jack never returned to the town. Although, according to rumors, he can sometimes still be seen in the same mirror hanging on the wall of the farm. The fog never leaves. Jack woke up in the middle of the night on the cold floor. His heart was beating so fast that it felt like it could explode at any moment. He got to his feet and looked around. The room was still the same, abandoned, filled with an awful chill. Yet something had changed. Just a few seconds ago, when he had been looking at the figure of the man in the mirror, it had seemed as if he were truly in another world, a world without rules and logic, where reality could shift before his eyes. Now, after trying to escape, nothing had changed. Just new shadows crossing in the darkness and the fog hanging outside the windows. But where was the man? Jack picked up the flashlight that had fallen from his hands. He began to carefully move through the room, searching for any clue that could explain what he had seen. His hands were trembling, but he couldn't allow himself to stop. He needed to understand what was happening here. Now, with the fog covering the town and time seeming frozen, it felt as if there was a secret in this place that Jack couldn't comprehend. After passing through several dark corridors, he came across an old wooden staircase leading down to the basement. Jack paused. A faint rustling sound from below made him feel an inexplicable sense of dread. But he needed to learn more. He stepped onto the first step. It creaked treacherously, and in that instant, Jack felt his heart stop for a second. With each step, the fog that filled the house grew thicker. The deeper he descended, the more he felt something watching him. The air was heavy, like an invisible weight trying to pull him down. As before, the voices seemed like echoes, resonating from all sides. And then, at the very bottom of the stairs, he saw what every person who had ever dared enter this place feared most. Large doors, covered in old carvings resembling human faces, were slightly ajar. Jack approached them, but just before opening them fully, he heard sounds. They resembled cries, or was it laughter? It was impossible to tell, but he couldn't turn away. He understood that he had to go inside if he wanted answers. Opening the door, he entered a room that looked like a chapel. Strange paintings hung on the walls, depicting scenes from the past when this house was still a home for people. But the most terrifying thing, each painting had eyes that seemed to watch Jack, no matter from which side he stood. And then, that same laughter. Desperate and distant, as if someone in this room had been watching him the whole time. Hearing another rustle, Jack turned and saw him. The same man who had stood in the mirror before. Now, he was standing right in front of Jack. He didn't move, but Jack felt that this man could step forward at any moment. His eyes didn't blink, and his gaze was empty, cold, like a soulless void. "Why didn't you leave?" the man asked, his voice quiet but sinister. "You should have gone, Jack, but you came here, so now you're one of us." I don't understand," Jack spoke in fear. His words scattered in the darkness, but they seemed to hold no importance. His attempts to find answers were in vain. "We all come here eventually," the man took a step forward. "And we never leave. This place takes anyone who stays. But don't be afraid. You're not alone." At these words, Jack felt a weight begin to crush him. The ground beneath his feet suddenly felt hollow, and he realized the earth beneath him was starting to give way. The entire house seemed to crumble and melt, turning into sand. The fog filled the room, enveloping him. Figures suddenly began to appear from the darkness. Other people. Laura spun around sharply and saw the man before her, the same one who had been in the mirror and now stood in front of her in the real world. "You're here to become part of this story, aren't you?" he asked, his face devoid of emotion. Laura paused for a moment, then answered fearlessly, "I just want to know the truth." Jack felt their hands pulling him deeper into the fog, trying to take him with them. His consciousness began to blur, and the image before his eyes melted into a terrible picture of chaos. This was not just a nightmare, it was something more, a reality with no beginning or end. This was a place where everyone who entered stayed forever. The fog once again consumed everything around him, and Jack vanished. The next morning in the town, everyone returned to their usual routines. The elderly people on the benches quietly spoke of the latest nighttime shadow that had appeared in the house on the outskirts. But they didn't notice the new whisper coming from the same place that had once been a farm. The fog, as before, remained, and no one suspected that the next victim would be someone else. After Jack disappeared, the town returned to its usual routine, though the atmosphere was noticeably tense. The fog that filled the streets seemed to grow thicker, and most people tried to avoid the farm, silently noticing how it had once again become the center of an invisible fear. People didn't talk about what happened to Jack, but those who listened carefully could hear whispers in the dark, as though his voice had now become part of the town, his presence lingering in the air, altering everything around. One evening, not long after Jack's disappearance, a young woman named Laura arrived in the town. She was a journalist specializing in investigating strange events and mystical phenomena. She was drawn to the story of the farm that frightened the residents and left them powerless before the unknown. Laura decided to investigate and find out what the place was truly hiding. The town was small, and everyone knew each other, but Laura appeared unfamiliar and intriguing, which couldn't help but draw attention. That same evening, after Laura entered the local bar, she began asking the townspeople questions. Everyone responded similarly, with discomfort and fear, as if it were part of their unspoken code. They didn't want to talk about the farm, and even when she gently mentioned Jack, everyone who listened became uneasy, and conversations grew quieter. Laura didn't stop. She decided to visit the farm the next day, although she already sensed that this place was tied to something larger than just scary stories. She felt she had to uncover the truth. At dawn, she set off towards the farm, ignoring the warnings. On her way, she came across an old man sitting on a stone by the road, watching her steps with a heavy expression on his face. "Don't go there, girl," he said, never taking his eyes off her. Laura stopped and looked at him carefully. "Why?" she asked. Laura stepped forward, pulling the heavy air behind her, which felt physically oppressive. She couldn't afford to break down. Staying here meant becoming another loss, another part of this cursed cycle. She couldn't stop now. Laura, however, didn't turn back. She nodded to him in farewell and continued on her way. When she arrived at the farm, everything looked just as described, an abandoned place with cracks in the walls and dirty windows through which nothing could be seen except the fog. Laura stepped over the thresholds, and despite the cold fear that gripped her, she entered the house. Inside, the place looked even worse. The walls seemed to absorb everything around her, and with each step, she felt an invisible force closing in. Laura passed through several rooms and finally found herself in a dark corridor leading to stairs that descended down. She couldn't suppress the small tremor. This path felt so familiar. Laura heard a rustling sound that seemed louder than her own breath. She lowered her head, but this time, she didn't feel afraid. Descending into the basement, Laura noticed old doors that were partially open, just like in the stories she had heard. Inside, there was a deep silence, and only the sound of her steps disturbed the stillness. She again felt something strange. Every movement, every word she thought to speak, was immediately swallowed by the darkness. Opening the door, Laura found herself in a spacious room that seemed intended for rituals. On the floor lay an old stone, surrounded by burning candles that had already begun to flicker out from age. In the center of the room stood the same mirror Jack had seen earlier, its surface covered in rust. Laura approached it and saw her reflection, but it wasn't quite her. In the mirror, there was another, unnatural shadow moving like a living creature. "You're looking for answers, just like he did," she heard behind her. Laura spun around sharply and saw the man before her, the same one who had been in the mirror and now stood in front of her in the real world. "You're here to become part of this story, aren't you?" he asked, his face devoid of emotion. Laura paused for a moment, then answered fearlessly, "I just want to know the truth. What happened to them? Why is this place cursed?" The man didn't respond immediately. He only nodded toward the mirror. Truth doesn't come easily. Sometimes it's better not to know. Because once you learn it, there will be nowhere left for you to go. But Laura was not afraid. She continued to stare at the mirror, hearing how the darkness within it began to change her reflection. Suddenly, she saw something terrifying, unclear, ominous figures that started to appear in the dark, reflecting the fear and horror that enveloped her. This was just the beginning. And Laura realized that now, after finding the answer, there would be no turning back. Laura stood, almost paralyzed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The darkness inside it began to intensify, and the figures grew clearer, more real. They weren't just ghosts, but something far more terrifying. Shadows that seemed to have a life of their own, sensing her presence, even watching her. "You can't leave," the man whispered softly, standing in the darkness behind her. His voice was distant, but there was something in it that made Laura feel a real danger. "This is no longer your story, Laura. You've become part of something much older, and no one knows when it will take its claim again. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe." Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. "I'm not afraid of you," she said firmly, though her voice sounded strained. She couldn't let this man and these creatures take her. She had to find a way out before she was fully consumed by this place. Her gaze returned to the mirror, and suddenly she understood. It wasn't just a mirror. It was a portal, a connection between two worlds, two realities. The shadows that appeared within it were the very figures others had seen, those consumed by this place. Jack, the others, they had all become part of this dark reality ruled by a terrifying force. Laura stepped forward, pulling the heavy air behind her, which felt physically oppressive. She couldn't afford to break down. Staying here meant becoming another loss, another part of this cursed cycle. She couldn't stop now. She realized that the only way to escape was to destroy the mirror, break this link, sever the connection between the worlds. All the hours she had spent here had been just a phase in her search for the truth. And now, she understood that the truth wasn't just the answers. The truth was in getting rid of this place, freeing everyone from its power. Laura struck the mirror. At first, a light tap, then a stronger one, and the mirror cracked. Laura struck again, and the crack spread across the entire surface. The shadows in the mirror stirred, as if alive, trying to hold her in place. Voices rumbled in her head, whispering that she couldn't escape, that this was her fate now. But Laura didn't stop. She knew that if she didn't break the mirror, she would remain in this world forever. She made one final powerful strike, and the mirror exploded into pieces. At the moment of the rupture, the fog that had enveloped the house began to dissipate. The darkness that had filled the room began to shrink, as if the force holding this world hostage was taking it away with it. Laura felt the connection between the worlds weaken. All the shadows that had been trapped in this place began to break apart like broken chains. She no longer heard the terrifying voices that had echoed only moments before. And then, when the last crack in the mirror shattered, Laura felt the force retreat, and it became easier to breathe. She looked around. The room began to change. The brick walls, which once seemed part of this dark reality, started to crumble. The fog dissipated. All the terrifying images, all the figures, vanished. Laura walked out of the room and saw the house begin to return to its normal appearance, though it was no longer the same place she had entered. When Laura stepped outside, she felt the world around her coming back to life. The sun began to break through the clouds, and the town looked almost ordinary. She glanced back at the farm. It was now just an abandoned house, holding nothing but memories of fear. And though she had freed the place, Laura knew that what had happened there would live forever in her memory. She returned to her car and drove away, not looking back. This was the end of her investigation, but there remained one question without an answer. What if there are other places like this? And would she ever feel safe again after what she had experienced? But this time, she had managed to escape. And perhaps that was the best thing she could have done. The story ended, but it left behind a scar that could not be erased. The fog that wakes at night may return, and no one knows when it will take its claim again. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.